All right, thank you so much, everyone, again for joining this ANZ Dynamics 365 FinOps team and Pakistan Microsoft Dynamics 365 and Power Platform community. So this is the first time like I'm hosting this session for both the communities covering the biggest regions from Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan, India, UAE. So this is a very interesting topic, and we got the product manager Srinath from Microsoft. Before we jump into the actual session, I just want to take a 1 minute to introduce all my volunteer speakers and attendees and say thank you to everyone who has joined us previously and who has joined us today. And this is just because of you, like we have reached to this stage, like we are getting bigger and bigger as ANZ in Pakistan Power Platform and Dynamics 365 community. So thank you so much. Uh, we have already shared the same agenda on both the groups on Pakistan and on also on the ANZ region. The main focus is just to gather all the Dynamics 365 and Power Platform professionals in one stage so that we can learn together, we can share together, and we can have more sessions directly from Microsoft product people so that we can actually upskill ourselves beforehand. You can always use few hashtags. There are so many standards, and we also have created one for ANZ, Dynamic 365 FinOps team, and similarly we have for Pakistan D65 FinOps D65 and Power Platform. Uh, you can search on our LinkedIn, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. All the recordings will be posted on our both the YouTube channels, ANZ and Pakistan Dynamics 365 and uh, Power Platform. So with this one, I would like to hand over Srinath today uh, to show us the magic, what we are going to do with the virtual tables virtually.
Yeah, thank you, Faisal. Thanks for everyone. Appreciate you guys taking time to connect with me and learn a little bit more about what we are doing with virtual tables. It's fascinating to see the interest across the community since I posted a small video last week on the PowerCat live show. So obviously that allowed me to connect with Faisal and come here to showcase the work that we're doing and also share with you where we are taking virtual tables in the near future. So as I get through today, I'm going to share my desktop and I'll be switching between a few screens between PowerPoint as well as some demos. So let me go ahead and do that. And I have a single monitor setup. So when I go full screen, just somebody speak out and let me know that you're able to see everything come through just okay. All right, everything.
Yep, it's all good. Yes, sorry, Srinath, you are on mute.
Okay, is my audio better now?
Yes, that's fine.
All right. Hey, as Faisal introduced, my name is Srinath, product manager on the Microsoft Dataverse platform team working on virtual tables. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or follow me on Twitter. I've also shared my email towards the end of the slide, so you can always email me if you have any questions. So what I want to do today is just give a quick introductions to virtual tables and share a little bit more around the current state of where things are and what we've enabled. I want to do this also through a demo where I want to show you how the different providers that we enable to create virtual tables come together. And I can go much deeper as we open up for Q&A as well, if you have any questions there. I want to specifically also talk about a new provider that we just announced in private preview, which is the virtual connector provider. I'll take a few minutes to talk specifically about that. And then, of course, share with you some of the roadmaps that we've planned in this calendar year. Please continue to post your questions as I'm going through the slide demo. Faisal will help monitor and open up for Q&A towards the end of the presentation. Also, this is an opportunity for me to connect with community and get some feedback and data. So I have, added some Slido questionnaires into my deck. So it'll be great if you can have your phone out so that you can scan the QR code as I present, so that I'm able to capture some responses from you. With that, let's get started. So this is just kind of getting started and getting warmed up with Slido. So I would love for you to basically scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter that session ID so that I'm able to capture some responses from you all. So what I would love to hear from you, I think when I switched on to full screen mode, I noticed that there were about 20 odd participants. So I would love to see if how many of you have had the opportunity to learn about virtual tables or use virtual tables as they were in the data platform for the last couple of years. I'll also do the same thing on my end so that I'm able to follow along the responses on my side. I'll give probably another 10 more seconds before I switch. We're coming close. It was about 1/3 had used, but now we are coming closer to 50-50 mark, which is good. Okay, I think that's good data. 60-40, that's a good ratio. So the question will still be active, but you can feel free to add more, and I'll collect the data after. So since we were somewhere around 60-40, 50-50, it's great to make introductions to many of you, the notion of virtual tables. As you know, Dataverse as a platform has certain native tables that come along with the platform that you can ingest data and store and use them. But at the same time, you can also define custom tables, so define the shapes of the tables in Dataverse and then also integrate data into them. So with virtual tables, what it allows is basically seamless and easy access to data residing in your enterprise, anywhere that may be, without the need of actually moving and replicating. So that's the power of virtual tables. And it requires no special infrastructure, just Dataverse alone as a platform enables this through a plethora of providers that we have here. And what a virtual table does is essentially it creates a logical abstraction and decouples how you access data irrespective of where its location or its configuration data resides. So you're able to do this through virtual table providers that are available on Dataverse, and I will be talking about each one of them in the subsequent slide. But we have a range of these providers starting from no code all the way to pro code abilities to basically connect with external data and then define the entities related to those external data and use them as if they just exist in Dataverse. So that's the power of virtual tables. You're able to define the shape similar to what you have in your external data source and actually then use that similar to how you've been using native tables or custom tables and use virtual tables in Dataverse. So today we support creating and managing virtual tables through 4 providers. And providers is essentially a way how we've developed this framework of being able to create this abstraction to connect with the external source and be able to create those tables in Dataverse. So the two of the connectors, two of the providers has existed in Dataverse for some time, but up until March, they were both supported only read-only operations. So they are the OData provider and the custom provider. So these two providers ship out of the box with Dataverse, and you have them available in all the environments across all the regions. And in March, we made updates to these two providers in that we enabled full CRUD support. So we shifted from just read-only to now being able to create, delete, or update records at runtime by connecting externally to the data sources that you have defined as part of setting up that virtual table. So for OData, it's basically no code. So essentially, if you're exposing your external data source as an OData service, then we basically just connect to the OData service and enable full CRUD operation. Whereas the custom provider is essentially for those data within your enterprise where it doesn't follow a certain protocol, or you want to basically create an API economy around that data and define your own construct for what would happen with the create, update, delete, and read operations. So you're able to create plugins, which I think many of you are familiar with in Dataverse, and you're able to use the plugin registration tool to define a data source by registering the assembly and then mapping the plugins that you have created for your virtual tables essentially to Dataverse, and then we are able to use those during runtime to make the necessary calls to the plugins so that the execution can happen. We have a third provider which focuses on Cosmos DB. So if you have data sitting in Cosmos DB and you have a need to virtualize them, you can use this provider. So there were some issues with this provider which we recently fixed, and we republished a new version of this on AppSource. So this provider today only supports read-only operations, and we are continuing to evaluate the usage and use cases and adoption of this to determine whether we'll make continuous investment in this provider to enable CUD support. Lastly, we introduced a new provider, and this is where we are going to make some continuous investments, and I'll talk to you about it when I get to the roadmap slide. And this provider is unique in the sense that there are over 300, 400 connectors, as you know, in the Dataverse environment. And we are essentially designed this provider as a way to wrap around the connectors and you being able to actually create virtual tables with these connectors. So today, to just get it out and get the feel for customers and partners using this and to provide some feedback, we've enabled this in private preview, and initially it supports the SQL Server connector. But we are planning to, of course, expand on this thing. But what I want to talk to you more about as I walk through some demos is basically have the opportunity for all of you to try this and give us a feedback so that we can continue to bake that in our roadmap so that we can get to the public preview and GA for this connector as we expand on the scope of this. So with this, what I want to do next is basically be able to bring all these things together and show you in a quick demo. What I'm able to do is basically I cooked up a scenario where many of these providers come together to show you how it's easy to set up in Dataverse. And also, I will happy to walk you through each one of this provider and give you a little bit more, backstage to how it got set up, right? So with that, let me switch to my first environment where I want to walk you through how the various connectors actually come along. To do that, let me get access to my, okay. So the first example, what I wanted to walk you through is imagine that there is an account and there are several employees or students or what have you, and they have a need to basically explore certain subjects and courses that they are interested in, right? So let me just walk you through the setup or the flow here and then talk each of the integrations separately. So what I have here is the account's native entity. So it's just part of Dataverse. And what I'm able to do is then for that account, I'm linking them to an external data source, which is sitting in a SQL Server where I have all of the employees or students, right? So the first integration is basically between a native entity with a virtual entity where for this account, I'm able to actually add a lot of employees. So as you can see here, I can actually browse through all the records that are sitting in my external database, and then I'm able to add those records into this view, okay, which is what I've done here. The next is obviously, there is a need to browse different subjects that are available for them. So I'm using an open source OData service that's published by Purdue University, and it has all these different courses and subjects that are part of the Purdue catalog. So I'm just using that as a way or a mechanism to actually show that. So what I had to do is, even though these two are OData, I just created a Cosmos DB environment in which I've been able to customize some of these subjects. So essentially, I'm able to look up all the subjects here. So I front loaded about 6 or 7 subjects, and you can see them here. And these are actually coming from a Cosmos DB environment. So this is a virtual entity. It has a many-to-many relationship with the account. So I can select as many as these I want and add them to this account, right? The next one is basically connecting to the same OData courses that Purdue has, and it's basically able to then bring all of that course information into my view. And again, I can select as many courses I want from this list and add them here, right? So as you can see, by enabling not only virtual tables, but more importantly, all the relationships that's possible, 1:n, n:1, or many-to-many relationships, you can actually imagine how you can build very versatile experiences by connecting both native tables as well as virtual tables, and also create relationships between virtual tables that are created from the same provider. So if you have relationships defined in the external source and you are using a specific provider connecting to the external source and creating as many virtual tables from that source, you are now able to also bring that relationship and actually reflect that relationship in Dataverse as you set them up. Okay. So let me just go behind the scenes a little bit here and walk you through the different steps that one had to take in order to set this up. For that, let me start with the Cosmos DB, because it's an easier one and it's read-only today. As you can see, I mentioned that I took about 6 of the subjects from the Purdue data, and I just created a quick list here. And the information that I would need to enable this is essentially the fields that are part of this entity, which is basically an ID field and the name field. And obviously the information related to my resource itself, right? So my resource is defined with this URI, right? And I have my own collection called the items. And essentially that is what I have used here in order to actually go set this up. So the setup of any virtual entities have very similar steps. So you would first go and define what we call as a virtual table data source. And you do that by going into settings, administration, virtual entity data source. And here I have the Cosmos provider. So all I had to do is to give it a name. And this is my collection name, as I showed you in my Azure portal, the to-do list. And I have an authorization key from Azure portal that I have here and my URI. Once the data source is set up, then you actually then go define the virtual table itself. To do that, you go to settings, customize settings, then go to the virtual tables. And here is sorry, I think it got refreshed here. So here is my Cosmos VE. And as you can see here, I would be selecting the data source that I just created. I gave it a name called Cosmos VE. I checked box this saying this is a virtual entity. I'm selecting the data source. And then more importantly, I'm actually typing the external name, which is the items, which is the name that I have given to the list of the collection of records that I have. And once this is done, the virtual table is ready for you to use. And in this case, it's read-only, so you are able to read, retrieve data, either for one record or multiple record. But in this case, as I mentioned to you, that I've created a relationship. In addition to defining the fields itself, I've also gone ahead and was able to set up the relationship between the account entity and this entity, and I call this the many-to-many. I have set this up as a many-to-many relationships. Okay, so that's how you set up a Cosmos a DB provider-based virtual entity. Okay. Now, let me switch gears and talk to you a little bit more about what I've been able to do with the rest of the entities. So first, let me talk to you about setting up a custom entity, right? So for custom entities, obviously, you're going to need to write some plugin code. So here's an example of that. What I have is basically in my database, a SQL Server database, I have a table called tickets. Call it virtual entity tickets, and essentially it's a way for me to collect tickets. It has 3 columns. It has a ticket ID, which is a GUID. Then there is a severity and a name column, which is basically collecting the description of that particular ticket. So then I've created the necessary operations. As I said, for custom providers, we support full CRUD operations. So I just have a helper class, which is helping me with all the connection strings that are required for that particular database. And I've gone ahead and created my create, delete, retrieve multiple, retrieve, and upload plugins. Right? So once these plugins ready and tested, I get an assembly. And then I'm simply using the plugin registration tool to actually register the assembly and create the data source for this environment. So, and as a result of that, what you will see here is basically my ability to retrieve the information. I just created a quick Power App, model-driven app connecting to that tickets, and be able to retrieve all that information. Now, again, the setup for this is very similar. It follows the same steps as I walked through with the Cosmos. The only difference here is basically when I go into administration and select a virtual table, I basically have to provide just the name of that particular. I select the correct providers and I just give the name. And then I'm essentially using that connector, the provider to define my virtual table. So again, this example, once the data source is set up, I simply come here to my customize view, select entities, and I'm defining my display name as VE tickets, and the external name, which is the database, is called VE tickets, and I have a custom data source provider for that ticket. Now, this obviously is a custom provider, so it enables for full CRUD operations. So for example, if I tick one of this thing and I just add this and save and close, and I can go back to my database, and you will see that without the refresh, it still shows us sample tickets. But if I go ahead and execute the statement again, you should see that that got updated as sample tickets editor, right? I can always go back here, select this record and delete it. And it's almost instantaneous because it's directly connecting to the source and executing the query in real time, in runtime. So we're able to do that. The next one I'll walk you through is basically using OData, which is also very simple. And for OData, what I have is basically a service endpoint where I have some contact information, right? I have some sample records here. This is basically directly hitting the OData service, and it's trying to fetch records that are in the external source here. And I have 2 records, which is what is again represented here as records in one of this model-driven app. So again, we just enabled full CRUD operations for OData. So I can actually go here and I can edit the values, save and close. It's reflected in my app. And at the same time, if I go ahead and query this, now that record got updated as Srinath can. Right? Come here and create a new. So I can type test name, test date, save and close. And I can again go back and execute that endpoint, and I'll be getting the 3rd one. So as you saw, we are easy. The setup is so easy that once you have a good understanding of what your external data source is and the definition of that entity, selecting the provider for your use case and setting up virtual entities is as simple as, just quick 2-3 minutes, max 5 minutes in setting up the virtual entity and getting started. I want to quickly switch back to the slide here. And what I want to actually then talk about before getting into the next provider, which is the virtual connector provider, I do want to collect some data from you in terms of having the understanding between what the OData custom Cosmos DB and virtual connector provider does. Love to get your input on which of these providers are you most likely to use based on your use cases and customers that you're working with. So if you have the opportunity to provide that information, that will be great validation for us in terms of which of these providers are more popular in terms of use cases out there. So I'll probably wait for another 10-15 minutes before I can get some data here. The last survey I had about 17 or 18 results. So I'll wait to get somewhere to that so that all of the data has a matching sample size. Maybe 5 more seconds. Okay, great, thank you. So I want to spend a little bit of time explaining the virtual connector provider that we just launched in private preview. Now, this is, of course, similar to the other providers in that it creates that abstraction of being able to create virtual tables, but it basically works hand in hand with our connector ecosystem. So as I explained, for this first private preview, we enabled the support for our SQL Server connector. And just wanted to walk you through the steps that you would take. And of course, I will show a representation of that in Dataverse as I walk you through an example as well. So in this first, as usual, if you're accessing data through a connector, you would set up your connector. And then what you would do is to create a connection reference using that connection that you just created, right? And you will be sharing this connection with all of the organization or users that are using this. In our example, we created a service principal and actually allowed the service principal to have access to this connector, and that is how you enable this provider in your environment. And then you create a data source similar to what I just showed you in the other 3 examples. So again, this step is similar to the other providers where you go define your data source. And when you're defining the data source, I'll show you that you're providing information as to which environment you are enabling this provider in. The details of your client principal or service principal that you created and the client secret that you created using Azure Active Directory. And about this provider is that when you define the data source, it automatically creates an entity in Dataverse, which is also a virtual table, by the way, called the entity catalog. And what the entity catalog is basically is a representation of all the data that you have or the tables that you have in your external source. And this gives you sort of a menu of tables that exist from which you can select the ones that you want to create the virtual tables. So the key difference is here in that as you select the table from the entity catalog, essentially the schema or the definition of that external data is already understood and the necessary schema or the fields are created for you, as compared to the virtual tables that you created using different providers. Once you create a data source, you will have to actually go into the entities view and create a virtual table and define its field and other things. So in this case, by selecting the table that's available for you to virtualize in entity catalog, the provider actually automatically creates then all the fields that are representational of that particular external source, right? So let me switch to that one example where I want to walk you through. And in this case, I'm using my this one, okay? So you'll see here that there are two entities with a prefix called custom entity sales LT product and custom entity sales LT product category. These two are virtual tables that are created using this provider. And just to show you where the data resides, as I mentioned, we enable this for SQL Server. I basically have a database called Adventure Works, in which I have this table called sales LSG product and product category. And this is the virtual table representation that you saw in Dataverse. And to set this up, you're essentially going to start with, as I said, step is to go to connections and use the connector and create a connection. And once you have created a connection, you will go to share and you will share this connection with the rest of the organization. So prior to doing this, you would have already created a service principal in this tenant. So essentially that is the service principal now has access to this connection. And then depending on the solution in which you are creating this, you would actually go and then create a connection reference that you can then use. In my case, I created the connection reference in my default solution. And if I go and see the connection reference here, and you will see that I have a connection reference called Adventure Cycles connection reference. If I edit this, you will see that I have selected that connection that I created using the SQL Server, right? So these are the only two steps that you will do as part of enabling the provider so that you can create the source. The next step that you will do is essentially go into your administration and then virtual entity data source. Again, same stuff as any other thing. And I have what's called as the Adventure Cycles data source defined here. And if I edit this, you will see the fields that you want to populate here. So you want to give it a name, and you will select the connection reference that you just created, which is internally using the connection. If you are enabling this in any other environment, in this case, I have a default environment only, so I did not type the GUID for that environment. But if you have other environments in which you are enabling this, you would type the GUID of that environment here. And then this is my tenant ID, and then I have the client ID, which is my service principal and the client secret. So once you set this up, essentially there is an asynchronous job that gets kicked off. And you can usually monitor that asynchronous job by going into the systems settings and systems job. And if you sort it by start time, you can actually see about 3 or 4 jobs that kicks off and they'll complete. Essentially, when they all succeed, what you will end up seeing is basically the entity catalog. And the way you can see the entity catalog is go to advanced find. And the entity catalog begins with an abbreviation entity catalog. So you can, it'll have entity catalog for the basically the connection reference that you created. So if I select the entity catalog for this and query the catalog, essentially this is going back to my SQL Server and fetching all the tables that you have in SQL Server. So this is what I meant by the entity catalog is essentially showing you a menu of all the virtual tables that you can actually select. So you would click on any one of this, and essentially that will bring you to a screen, which is where you're creating this virtual table. So my virtual table for product is already set up. So this is just going to reflect the values that I set up when I created the virtual table. So let's give it just a second for it to show up, or I'll refresh the screen again. So what you'll end up doing here is that you can select the value yes. And what this does is, if you're changing your data source for any reason, you're adding a column, extending a column, what have you, by creating this refresh entity, every time you're able to come to the screen, it will make a specific call to your backend and it will try to fetch all the fields for you. In this case, it's going to pull any new fields that you added, and this is showing the list of all the fields that are of type string or nvar, for example, in SQL Server. And this is basically where you select the primary field that you want to set for that particular entity, right? So as you know, entities always require a primary key and a primary field. So the primary key is already set for you in this provider. It's just asking you that, hey, I have found many columns in this particular table that are of type string. Which one of these would you want to set for a primary field? So that's what you're doing here. And once you have this set up, as I said earlier, you will come back to your data in tables, and you will find a virtual table created called custom entity sales products. And again, this is full CRUD operation, so you can actually see all the data. I can take one of this, for example, and I can go edit them. So the easier one is for the category, so that the values are far less. So I can go here and you will see something called bikes. So I can select this, edit the record, and I can just say, change this bike to, probably my category was wrong. I want to say road bikes, save this. All right, so this happens to me often. Might not happen to you because I use the same browser and I switch between, as you can see, I'm in private, I'm switching between multiple environments. So sometimes I get that error message, but if you're not frequently switching using the same browser between different environments using different accounts, you will not see that. But the key point is the truth is really going and actually executing the query in the backend to see if that update got changed. So I'm going to go and I'm going to select the top 100 rows. And you will see that here that I have road bike. So I can come here and I can change this to just to give you just to show that it is updating even though that error message came. So I go back here and edit this again, and you will see that highway bike show up here. Okay. So yeah, so each one of this demo, as I showed you, is essentially walking you through the different providers, and hopefully you got a good idea of seeing the steps that I took. Obviously, a lot of this is documented, and you can always go to App Source, download this provider, and there is an accompanying walkthrough document that you can use to exactly replicate the demo that I just showed you for you to kind of follow along. With that, I want to quickly switch to the roadmap. I want to just a few quick minutes here, and then I have a few more questions for you to collect some data, and then we can open up for Q&A. So when we look at virtual tables, essentially our investment falls into two buckets. So one is the virtual table framework itself, which consider that as foundational for all the providers that we develop. So based on various feedback and other engagement with customers, we are definitely trying to make virtual tables come closer and closer to native entities in Dataverse. So for that, we have to start supporting different primary key formats, being able to actually connect to systems where if a table doesn't have a string column, we can still be able to intelligently create a primary field rather than having that restriction today that your source would need to have at least one column of type string in order for us to be able to create virtual tables. So that's something that's in works. And of course, extending virtual tables to support several other attribute types. For example, today we do not support currency or money, depending on what data sources we use. But we are obviously extending and looking at all the data types that our native entity supports, and we are trying to extend the framework for virtual tables to support that as well. So any work that we do in our framework or foundational basically adds value to the any and all providers that we have. So as I walk through the virtual connector provider, I told you that today we have extended support only for SQL Server. But what we are doing is basically we are trying to split this virtual connector into two paths. So there are several connectors within our ecosystem that uses a certain design, which falls into what we call as a tabular connector. SQL Server is actually one of them. And essentially what that means is at the end of the day, the underlying data is easily represented in rows and columns, right? Easy to understand. And we have about 26 such connectors. And we want to basically generalize this provider so that it can support any connector that is by nature a tabular connector. And the second one is there are always going to be some data which is not represented in rows and columns, and obviously some or many of them are going to be defined as custom connectors. As you know, in Dataverse, you can create custom connectors, register them, and use them to connect your external data. So we are also going to extend support for a virtual connector provider to support custom connectors. So obviously, this is where you would have defined your own custom API using Swagger, 2.0 as your definitions, and we'll be able to interpret those API definitions automatically and determine whether we have the necessary design patterns in your API that would enable that custom connector to be virtualized. So these are the two key provider investments that we are making in this calendar year. And you can expect to see the support for virtual connector for tabular connectors come early. And then in parallel, we are working on the support for custom connectors. Okay. So with that, I'm just highlighting for you what I believe are some of the most commonly or high usage tabular connectors that we have. And there are some decisions that we are taking in terms of our ability to validate and support many of these things. So I would love to get your feedback on which of these tabular connectors are you familiar with or you use or likely to use. So this will also help us determining, which of these things we can additively keep adding support for that provider. I'll wait for about 10 seconds. I think the first survey had the most, the second one was a little low, but I'd love to see this somewhere around the 15 to 20, uh, you know, count so that the data is representational of the feedback that you're giving us across all these questions. Five more seconds. Okay, thank you. Along those lines, I have the next question, which is very interesting, is do you see a use case or the ability to virtualize another Dataverse environment itself? 5 more seconds. Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave this question open. So this is just a way for me to collect any feedback or any other specific use cases that you may have. You can feel free to either type them here or you can add them to the Q&A channel. But also I'm leaving my email with you in the next slide. So you're more than welcome to connect with me offline and share. So I'm also happy to jump on a call with any one of you who have some unique use cases that I would love to understand and know more and explore how virtual entities can actually support and add to our backlog. All right. So I'll leave that here. And in the interest of time, we have about 11 minutes. So I'd love to open up for Q&A. So I'll leave this slide open here. And Faisal, if you don't mind, we can switch to Q&A. And if you're new to virtual tables, as we saw earlier in the first slide, please go to aka.ms/virtual tables. That's a good starting point for you to understand and walk through some of the content there. And also that's my email address, and you can feel free to email me there as well. So thanks for the time. I'd love to understand more of your questions and answer as many as them as I can here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Srinath. So we got two questions here. Does queuing virtual tables uses OData under the hood?
Does querying virtual table use OData under the hood? So each provider is slightly different. So however, once you have virtual tables set up, you can still access them similar to how you access other tables within Dataverse. So which is you go to the environment/API/data/v9.0/entity name. You can still use that as a way to query the table. Second question here is, are virtual tables recommended for high volume scenario or building Power BI for high volume data for virtual tables? I'm not sure what high volume means. So you can query as many records as you want, but you would be responsible for defining the end user experience in terms of how you paginate through those records and make those necessary calls. But most use cases for virtual table applies towards operational or transactional type of scenarios or sort of reference data that you want to bring into an applications. Since we don't persist the data in Dataverse, we are not able to do any computations or roll-ups or calculations on top of this data. So it doesn't naturally lend to any kind of broader analytical kind of scenarios, right? So just keep that in mind as you think about virtual tables. Okay, the next one from Manish is more of a comment. Okay, so yeah, others, please free to come off mute and talk, or happy to post any questions that I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, if anyone has any question, please raise your hand. I'm happy to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question.
Rakshit has a question with regards to dynamic CC2 products. What is the vision for virtual tables? Yeah, you will actually start seeing more and more of Dynamics 365 apps natively support virtual tables. For example, we partner very closely with our finance and operations team, and there's a ton of work that are happening around finance and operations with its integration with Dataverse using virtual tables. Another one such collaboration that we have with them is actually being able to do business events on top of virtual tables. So that's also coming, and it'll be announced through FNO. And when that happens, then we will just validate that functionality across all the providers that we have that supports creation of virtual tables. So in addition to the CRUD operation, you can then also use events on top of the virtual table. So that is also coming.
Yes, Navneet, you can unmute yourself if you want to, or you can type your question, please.
Yeah, so thanks, Faisal. So the question for Srinath is, are virtual tables accessible for locations outside of the US? Because I just saw that demo the other day on the Microsoft Business the Business Application Summit. And then when we tried to run the scenarios for virtual tables, it was not accessible in, there are some limitations for doing certain capability. I mean, with respect to capabilities, there are limitations for non-US locations. Is that the case? Can you elaborate and provide some insights on that?
No, Navneet, that shouldn't be the case. As I said, the OData provider and the custom provider ships out of the box with Dataverse. So
Yes.
it's available in all the region, any region that has Dataverse available, you have the provider available along with it. The the virtual connector provider, when we announced private preview, we only enabled it for the Americas region. But since
Okay.
then, we actually opened it up for all environments in all the regions. So you should not have any challenges downloading that in a different region and installing and try it. Now, if you have tried this in the last week or so, and if you're running into any specific issues, please shoot me an email with the environment ID and which region the environment belongs to. And I'm happy to look at if there is any kind of a freak issue regarding that.
Okay. Thanks. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
So with respect to big data, are these going to be available? Are virtual tables or virtual connectors be enabled for getting through to big data, as the other person mentioned? For big data, what's the roadmap? Is it going to be available as a premium capacity, or is it going to be available under the pro capacity? Because data flows are available if in Power BI under premium capacity. So can you provide some insights on that?
Yeah, so is it fair to assume when you say big data, like data stored in Azure Data Lake, for example?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so as you saw in one of the slides, we talked about the virtual connector provider, and both Azure Cosmos DB as well as Azure Data Lake are considered tabular connectors for us. So there is already an Azure Data Lake connector available in the Dataverse environment. And when we enable support for that, you should technically be able to connect to Azure Data Lake and use data sitting there as a virtual table. So if the connectors themselves are a premium connectors, then that's the licensing that it applies. But the virtual provider that wraps around the connector itself is just available for you to use.
Okay, thanks. And will these virtual tables also be geo-redundant? Is that something that's available, like the Azure services that we have?
When you said geo-redundant, can you just expand on that, please?
So let's say, for example, we have a primary location as the US, and there should be an alternative business location in Australia, for example. So if the Australian region goes down, will the US location be able to take up the load, etc., like a backup location, etc.?
That's actually a very good question. Why didn't I
Yeah,
think?
because the reason I'm asking that question is because I had an instance in a project where before go live, we had the regional data center go down, and we weren't able to get an update for almost like 48 hours, and we were like 24 hours to cut over. That's why I'm asking that.
Got it. Yeah, I'll definitely take an action on that, and I can respond back. So Navneet, why don't you just email me so that I have an email that I can respond back? But what I would add is that, especially in the context of the virtual connector provider, we are just wrapping around the connector design and connector functionality, right? So
Okay.
when you set up the connector pointing to a particular Azure URI, and if the failover automatically happens behind the scene, then that's just passed on to the virtual provider, right? So that will be very transparent or black box to us, right? So that in my sense, that would just work. So just please shoot me an email, and I'm happy to confirm that with my engineering team and respond back to you.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for that.
So excellent, thank you, Srinath. Let's take one more question from Rajit. How is the data secured when export via virtual tables? Does the source system secure or we need to build security layer in Dataverse?
So thanks for that question, Rakshit. So when it comes to the connector, so whatever the security mechanism through which the connector operates, it's available for you. As you saw when you set up the connector, you have the ability to set up either through SQL authentication or Windows authentication or what have you. The one thing I do have to tell you is that all of these are ALM supported. That means when you do move them from one environment to another environment and share it with a different set of users, the connection is shared with the user, but when they actually go to that connection, they'll be forced to type in their username password to access that connection. So that is how the system is set up with the connection references. So they will have to type in their username password to make sure that they actually have access to the underlying data before you can use. The sharing of the service principal is essentially just for the underlying data provider to have access to the connection. The connection itself is individually managed to the users. Now, when it comes to custom connector, though, it's entirely up to you to how you manage access and authentication. Like I showed you, I had a helper class called connections.cs in which I was handling authentication. In that, it was a straightforward authentication because I was just using a connection string and connecting to a direct username password. But since it's custom connector, you can happy to choose, Azure Key Vault or anything where you store that information, and your custom provider essentially is then managing that authentication for you.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of comments there. Just would like to answer those one. Yes, the record session is being recorded, so I'll be uploading this one to the dedicated YouTube channel. So stay tuned on my next LinkedIn post. So I'll be sharing those ones there. Excellent, right, Srinath, we are on time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to connect with you all. Love to hear any feedback as you explore your use cases and use different providers. So